Commander Thys Veltar stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching death approach through the black of space. The enemy ships moved like nothing she had ever seen before. They twisted and bent, their dark metal hulls seeming to fold in on themselves as they came closer to Zephyria Prime. "How many civilians are still planetside?" she asked her communications officer. 2.3 million, Commander. The evacuation transports are working as fast as they can, but we need more time. Thys looked at the tactical display. 12 Confederation ships against, she counted again, 37 enemy vessels. But calling them vessels felt wrong. These things looked like they had been built by someone who hated the very idea of ships. Their surfaces rippled like liquid metal, and sometimes parts of them simply weren't there, as if reality had forgotten to finish drawing them. The Void Seekers had returned after sleeping for thousands of years. Every spacefaring race had stories about them, but most people thought they were just old tales told to scare children. The ancient machines that ate light and devoured matter itself. The things that came from the empty spaces between galaxies. "Commander, we are receiving distress calls from 17 other systems," her tactical officer reported. "The same type of ships have appeared across the spiral arm. Colaris Station, New Thessia, the mining worlds of the Outer Belt. They're all under attack. At the same time." Thys felt cold spreading through her chest. This wasn't a raid or a conquest. This was extermination on a scale that defied imagination. "Any word from Fleet Command?" "Nothing, sir. All long-range communications are being jammed by some kind of quantum interference." The first enemy ship opened fire, and Thys watched reality break apart. The weapon didn't look like a laser or a missile. It looked like a crack spreading through empty space itself. When it hit the Confederation cruiser Stellar Wind, the ship didn't explode. It simply stopped existing. Where 500 meters of armored hull had been, there was now a hole in space that hurt to look at. "All ships evasive maneuvers," Thys shouted into her comm. "Do not let those weapons touch you." Her fleet scattered, but the enemy had more of those reality-cracking weapons. The destroyer, Quick Justice, tried to use its speed to get behind one of the Void Seekers, but the enemy ship folded space around itself and appeared directly in front of the destroyer. Another crack of non-existence, and the Quick Justice was gone. "Commander, the enemy is targeting the evacuation transports," her sensor operator called out. Thys watched in horror as 3 civilian ships, each carrying 50,000 refugees, simply vanished as the dark weapons found them. Entire families, children, elderly couples who had spent their whole lives on Zephyria Prime, all of them erased from existence in less than a second. "Take us into attack formation," she ordered. "All ships, target the lead enemy vessel. Fire. Everything." The remaining Confederation ships opened fire with plasma cannons, quantum torpedoes, and mass drivers. The weapons struck the closest Void Seeker and did nothing. The energy blast passed right through the enemy ship as if it wasn't entirely there. The torpedoes exploded harmlessly against shields that seemed to exist in several dimensions at once. The enemy returned fire. 4 more Confederation ships disappeared into cracks in reality. "Commander," her engineering officer's voice was tight with fear, "our reality anchors are failing. Whatever those weapons are, they're making space-time unstable around us. If we stay here much longer, we might just fall out of existence even without being shot." Thys looked at the tactical display again. 6 ships left out of 12. The evacuation was less than half complete. At this rate, everyone on Zephyria Prime would die, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her communications officer suddenly straightened. "Commander, I'm picking up a very faint signal from the outer system. It's using an old emergency frequency, pre-Confederation military codes." "Play it." The message was broken and full of static, but she could make out some words. "Monitoring situation. En route. Maintain distance. Weapons designed for." "That frequency," her tactical officer said slowly. "I've seen it in the historical databases. It's a Terran signature, human." Thys almost laughed. "Humans? They disappeared from civilized space 30 years ago. Besides, their technology was always decades behind ours. What could they possibly do against this?" Another crack of darkness split space nearby, and the cruiser Harmony's light simply stopped being. The hole where it had existed began to grow, consuming the debris of other ships and even bending light around its edges. "Commander, we have to retreat," her first officer urged. "We can't save anyone if we're all dead." Thais wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. The enemy was systematically destroying her fleet, and their weapons were making space itself dangerous to exist in. She was about to give the retreat order when her sensor operator gasped. "Commander, something's happening to the planet." On the main screen, Zephyria Prime looked wrong. Patches of its surface were simply missing, replaced by the same terrible darkness that had swallowed her ships. But these holes were growing, spreading across continents like a disease. Entire cities vanished in moments, leaving behind expanding voids that consumed mountains and oceans. "The whole planet is being unmade," her science officer whispered. "They're not just attacking the surface, they're destroying the planet at the quantum level." Thais realized that even if she could somehow defeat the enemy fleet, it was already too late for Zephyria Prime. The world below was dying, reality itself unraveling as the Void Seeker's weapons worked their terrible magic. She opened a channel, on all frequencies, broadcasting as widely as possible. "This is Commander Thys Veltar of the Confederation Defense Force to any vessels in the outer spiral. Zephyria Prime has fallen. The Void Seekers have returned. They have weapons that can unmake matter itself. Warn the core worlds. Tell them the ancient enemy is real, and it's coming for everyone. Remember us." As she finished the transmission, the last of her escort ships disappeared into a crack in space. Her own flagship, the Harmony's Edge, shuddered as its power systems failed. The reality anchors went offline, and Thys felt a strange lightness as if she was becoming less real by the moment. The bridge lights flickered and went out. Emergency power lasted just long enough for her to see the planet below finish dying, the last of its continents swallowed by expanding voids. Then the darkness took her ship too. In the silence of space, only the enemy remained. The Void Seekers hung motionless for a moment, as if listening for something. Then they folded space around themselves and vanished, heading deeper into Confederation territory where billions more lives waited to be unmade. Where Zephyria Prime had once orbited, there was now only a sphere of absolute nothingness, slowly consuming the light of distant stars. The first world had fallen. 16 more would follow in the next 3 days. But in the deepest reaches of the Outer Rim, in territories that civilized races had written off as lawless frontier space, something was stirring. Old ships were powering up their engines. Weapons that had been hidden for 30 years were being armed and tested. The humans had heard the call for help, and they remembered what the galaxy had forgotten. Sometimes the greatest threats required the most desperate solutions. Captain Grix Ironmaw had been a pirate for 23 years, and he had never seen anything that scared him as much as empty space where a star system should be. His ship, the Bloody Prophet, hung at the edge of what had once been the Zephyria system, its sensors trying to make sense of readings that violated every law of physics. "Captain?" His navigator, a nervous Korthak named Vess, checked his instruments for the 5th time. "The star charts say there should be a yellow sun here, 3 planets, 2 asteroid belts, and a major mining colony, but there's nothing." Nothing, Grix realized as he studied the main display. Something worse than nothing. Where the Zephyria system had existed 3 days ago, there was now a perfect sphere of absolute darkness, not the darkness of empty space, which was still full of radiation and cosmic dust, but true nothingness that seemed to eat light itself. "Captain, you need to see this," his science officer called from her station. Kira was an ex-Confederation researcher who had joined his crew after some unpleasantness with her former employers. "The void sphere is growing. It's consuming matter from the surrounding nebula at a rate of approximately 1 cubic kilometer per hour." Grix felt his stomach twist. He had come here following rumors of a mining accident, thinking there might be valuable salvage floating around. Pirates across the sector had heard whispers of easy pickings from Zephyria Prime. Instead, he had found something that made him want to run back to the deepest, safest hiding hole he knew. How big is that thing, he asked. The sphere itself is roughly 200 million kilometers in diameter, Kira replied. Big enough to have swallowed the entire inner system, including the star. Vess made a whimpering sound. Captain, can we please leave now? This place feels wrong. My scales are itching, and my grandfather always said that meant bad spirits were nearby. Grix was about to agree when his communications officer suddenly sat up straight. Captain, I'm picking up a signal, very faint, but it's definitely artificial. From where? The edge of the void sphere. It appears to be a Confederation emergency beacon. Grix stared at the tactical display. Nothing should be able to exist that close to whatever had eaten the Zephyria system, but his sensors confirmed it. A single small object, broadcasting a distress signal on a loop. It's an escape pod, Kira reported. Confederation military design. Life support appears to be functional, but barely. Every instinct Grix had developed, over 2 decades of piracy, told him to run. Whatever had destroyed an entire star system was not something he wanted to encounter. But the information in that escape pod could be worth more than any cargo he had ever stolen. The Confederation would pay millions for intelligence about what had happened here. Best take us in, slowly, and keep our engines warm for a fast exit. The Bloody Prophet crept toward the void sphere, its hull creaking under the stress of gravitational anomalies that shouldn't exist. As they got closer, Grix could see that the sphere wasn't just empty, it was actively wrong. Light bent around it in impossible ways, and his instruments kept giving readings that made no sense. Captain, Kira's voice was tight with fear. Our reality anchors are struggling. Whatever that thing is, it's making space-time unstable. If we get much closer, we might not be able to maintain coherent existence. Just a little farther, Grix muttered, watching the escape pod grow larger on his screen. It was tumbling slowly, its hull scarred and blackened as if it had been through a battle, but it was intact, which was more than could be said for anything else in the system. They managed to grab the pod with their tractor beam and haul it into the cargo bay. As soon as it was aboard, Grix ordered a retreat to a safe distance. The Bloody Prophet pulled away from the void sphere, and he felt his crew collectively release breaths they hadn't realized they were holding. The escape pod contained a single occupant, a young Confederation communications officer named Kess Arndale. She was barely conscious, her uniform torn and her eyes wide with terror. When Grix's medical officer tried to examine her, she grabbed his arm and whispered, "The ships that eat light. They came from between the stars. Nothing could hurt them." It took several hours to get her stable enough to talk coherently. When she finally did, her story made Grix's blood run cold. They weren't ships, she said, sitting in the Bloody Prophet's medical bay with a cup of synthetic coffee warming her hands. Not really. They were like someone had taken the idea of a ship and twisted it into something that hated existence itself. Their weapons didn't destroy things. They unmade them, made them never have been. She had survived because her escape pod had been launched just as the enemy's reality-warping weapons had begun tearing apart her ship. The quantum distortions had somehow protected her, throwing her clear of the battle just before her entire fleet simply stopped existing. "How many ships attacked?" Grix asked. 37 in our system, Kess replied. But we received distress calls from 16 other systems before communications went down. All the same type of enemy, all the same impossible weapons. Grix felt his fortune sense tingling. Information about a new enemy that could destroy entire star systems would be incredibly valuable to the right buyers. But as he was planning his next move, Kira called him to the bridge. "Captain, long-range sensors are detecting additional void spheres," she reported. 17 of them, scattered across the spiral arm. Each one marks where a Confederation world used to be. Grix studied the star chart, noting the pattern of destruction. The enemy was moving in a clear line toward the densely populated core worlds, consuming everything in their path. But there was something odd about their route. "Vess, plot their trajectory," he ordered. His navigator worked for several minutes, then looked up with confusion. "Captain, this doesn't make sense. They're taking a longer route than necessary. Their path deliberately avoids this entire region here." He highlighted a section of the outer rim on the star chart. Grix recognized the area immediately, the terminus expanse, a lawless stretch of space that most civilized races avoided. It was rumored to be home to pirates, outcasts, and stranger things. But most interesting of all, it was where humans were said to have built hidden colonies after they had disappeared from galactic politics 30 years ago. Why would something powerful enough to eat star systems avoid human space? Kira wondered aloud. It was a good question. Humans had always been considered primitive by Confederation standards. Their technology was decades behind. Their military was small, and they had shown no interest in galactic politics after some kind of falling out with the Confederation leadership. Most races had simply forgotten about them. But something that could unmake reality itself was actively avoiding their territory. Grix made a decision that would either make him rich beyond imagination or get him killed in ways that physics said were impossible. "Vess, set course for the terminus expanse. I want to know what the humans have been doing out there that makes universe-eating monsters nervous." As the Bloody Prophet jumped to hyperspace, Kess Arndale sat in her quarters, staring at the data chip she had pulled from her escape pod's computer core. It contained detailed sensor readings from the battle, tactical analysis of the enemy weapons, and something else, a fragment of enemy communications that her ship's computers had managed to intercept before being destroyed. The transmission was in no language she recognized, but the meaning was clear enough. The Void Seekers weren't just attacking randomly. They were following some kind of plan, systematically destroying worlds in a specific order. And according to the transmission, they were only the advance force. Something much larger was coming from the space between galaxies. Something that made the world-eating ships look small by comparison. As she fell asleep to the hum of the ship's engines carrying her toward human space, Kess wondered if whoever they were going to find would be any match for the darkness that was spreading across the galaxy. The Confederation had failed completely. Their best ships and weapons had been useless against an enemy that could edit reality itself. But maybe, just maybe, the humans had learned something during their 30 years of exile. Maybe being written off by the galaxy had given them time to prepare for threats that civilized races couldn't imagine. Or maybe they were all doomed, and the only choice left was how long they could delay the inevitable. Admiral Sarah Chen stood in the observation deck of the New Geneva, watching the construction yards of Terminus Station work around the clock. Hundreds of ships moved through the massive space docks, some being built, others being retrofitted, with weapons that most of the galaxy thought were impossible to create. She had been expecting news like the message from the pirate ship for months. Human deep space monitoring stations had been detecting strange readings from the galactic void, energy signatures that matched ancient warnings found in ruins scattered across the outer rim. The Void Seekers were returning, just as the old records had predicted. Admiral, her aide, Lieutenant Commander Jackson Torres, approached with a data pad. "The intelligence package from the salvage vessel has been analyzed. It's worse than we thought." Sarah took the pad and reviewed the tactical data from the Zephyria battle. The Void Seekers' weapons were exactly what the ancient texts had described. Reality-editing devices that could unmake matter at the quantum level. But seeing the actual sensor readings made the threat feel immediate and personal. 17. Systems destroyed in coordinated attacks, she murmured. "They're not raiding, they're executing a systematic extermination protocol." "Yes, ma'am. Our analysts estimate they'll reach the core worlds within 6 months if they maintain their current pace. The Confederation has already lost approximately 40 billion citizens." Sarah closed her eyes and tried not to think about the scope of that number. 40 billion people simply erased from existence as if they had never lived at all. She had seen war before, had commanded fleets in battles where millions died, but this was something beyond warfare. This was the systematic deletion of entire civilizations. "What's the status of Operation Lazarus?" she asked. "The Prometheus Unbound is ready for deployment. Captain Marcus Torres has handpicked his crew, and the ship's reality anchor systems have been tested and calibrated. The quantum foam generators are operating within acceptable parameters, and the primary weapon has been loaded with our latest reality disruption warheads. Sarah nodded, then walked to the observation window to look out at the ship that represented 30 years of human ingenuity and preparation. The Prometheus Unbound didn't look like any other vessel in known space. It was angular and predatory, built around a massive forward cannon that seemed to bend light around itself. Every line of its hull had been designed with one purpose: to fight enemies that existed partially outside normal physics. After humanity's exodus from Confederation space, they had used their freedom from galactic technology restrictions to explore theoretical concepts that other races considered too dangerous or impractical. While the Confederation built bigger and more conventional weapons, humans had delved into the deepest secrets of space-time itself. "Admiral," Torres continued, "the crew understands this is likely a one-way mission. The Void Seekers have never been defeated in recorded history. But Captain Torres believes we can at least gather enough intelligence to give the main fleet a fighting chance." Sarah had served with Marcus Torres during the Human-Vrex border war, back when Earth was still part of the Confederation. He was one of the best tactical minds she had ever worked with, and more importantly, he understood the kind of thinking needed to fight an enemy that didn't follow conventional rules of engagement. "The irony isn't lost on me," she said quietly. 30 years ago, the Confederation rejected our warnings about ancient threats stirring in dark space. They called us paranoid and primitive. They blocked our expansion into the outer rim and limited our access to advanced technology. So we left, Torres nodded, and used that isolation to build weapons they said were impossible. The human exodus hadn't been driven by anger or resentment, though those emotions had certainly played a part. It had been driven by fear of threats that the Confederation refused to acknowledge. Human archaeological teams had found ruins on dozens of worlds, all telling the same story. Ancient civilizations that had thrived for millennia before being consumed by something from the void between galaxies. Most races dismissed these findings as mythology or primitive superstition. Humans had taken them seriously and begun preparing for the day when the ancient enemy would return. "What's the Council's decision on intervention?" Torres asked. Sarah pulled up the results of the emergency session held 3 days ago. The Terran remnant government had debated for 12 hours before reaching a consensus. "We're going to help them," she said. "Not because we owe the Confederation anything, but because if the core worlds fall, the Void Seekers will eventually turn their attention to us." She brought up a strategic projection showing the enemy's likely expansion pattern. Based on the data from Zephyria Prime, the Seekers appear to be targeting worlds with the highest population densities first. They're consuming the galaxy's major civilization centers before moving on to the frontier regions. "If we don't stop them at the core worlds, we'll face them alone out here." "With respect, Admiral," Torres said, "we've been alone out here for 30 years, and we've used that time well." He was right. The Terran remnant fleet represented the most advanced military force in the galaxy, though few people knew it existed. Their ships incorporated technologies that other races thought were theoretical impossibilities. Reality anchor fields that could stabilize space-time in combat zones, quantum foam generators that could destabilize enemy weapons, and most importantly, weapons specifically designed to fight entities that existed partially outside normal reality. "The Prometheus Unbound will conduct reconnaissance and field testing," Sarah decided. "If our weapons prove effective, we'll commit the full fleet. If not..." She didn't finish the sentence. If their weapons failed, there would be nowhere left to run. Captain Marcus Torres reviewed his mission parameters one final time as his ship prepared to depart Terminus Station. The Prometheus Unbound was humanity's most advanced warship, but it was also untested against the kind of enemy they were about to face. Everything they knew about the Void Seekers came from ancient texts and archaeological evidence. This would be the first time in recorded history that someone had deliberately sought them out for battle. His crew of 200 volunteers understood the risks. They were flying into combat against an enemy that had never been defeated, using weapons, based on theories that most physicists considered impossible, but they were also the culmination of 30 years of human preparation for exactly this war. "All stations report ready," his first officer announced. "Take us out," Marcus ordered. The Prometheus Unbound pulled away from Terminus Station and accelerated toward the edge of human space. As it jumped into hyperspace, heading for the expanding zone of destruction, its crew made final preparations for a battle that would determine whether their species' long exile had been worthwhile. Behind them, Admiral Chen watched until the ship disappeared into the swirling colors of hyperspace. Then she turned to her communications officer. "Signal the fleet commanders," she ordered. "Begin full mobilization protocols. If the Prometheus Unbound proves our weapons work, I want every ship we have ready to deploy within 72 hours. The Terran remnant fleet began to stir to life. Hundreds of ships that had been hidden in asteroid bases and mobile stations throughout the outer rim. Vessels designed and built in secret, incorporating 30 years of research into fighting enemies that existed outside normal space-time. The galaxy had written humanity off as primitive and irrelevant. They were about to discover just how wrong they had been. When no help was expected, when conventional weapons had failed completely, humanity would emerge from the infinite black not as refugees or supplicants, but as the guardians they had always chosen to become. The ancient enemy had returned to consume another galaxy. But this time, they would face opponents who had spent 3 decades preparing specifically for their arrival. Fleet Admiral Zarthek had commanded military forces for 40 years, but he had never seen anything like the defense fleet assembled at the Helix Nebula. 800 ships from 12 different Confederation worlds, representing the largest military force in galactic history. If this couldn't stop the Void Seekers, nothing could. The plan was simple. Use the nebula's dense matter as cover, create overlapping fields of fire, and hold the line until civilian evacuations were complete. Every military academy in the Confederation had studied the defensive advantages of fighting in a nebula environment. The thick gases would disrupt enemy sensors and provide concealment for tactical movements. The plan lasted exactly 4 minutes, and 37 seconds after the enemy arrived, Zarthek watched in horror as the Void Seekers simply began unmaking the nebula itself. Their weapons didn't target individual ships. They targeted reality. Vast sections of cosmic gas and stellar dust simply ceased to exist, leaving behind expanding voids that made spacetime unstable for thousands of kilometers around. "All ships, maintain formation," he ordered. But even as he spoke, he could see his carefully planned defense crumbling. Ships that ventured too close to the expanding voids didn't explode or get destroyed. They just stopped existing, as if they had never been built. The enemy moved through his fleet like death itself, their twisted ships phasing in and out of normal space. Conventional weapons passed right through them. Energy shields were useless against weapons that could edit matter out of existence. In less than 20 minutes, Zarthek had lost over 200 vessels. "Admiral," his communications officer called out, "I'm detecting a single ship approaching from the outer rim. It's moving at impossible velocity and broadcasting on an emergency frequency." "Show me," Zarthek ordered. The tactical display highlighted a ship unlike anything in the Confederation databases. It was angular and predatory, built around what appeared to be a massive forward cannon that distorted space around itself. More disturbing was its speed. The vessel was approaching at velocities that should turn any crew into paste. "Sir, the ship is transmitting." "Confederation vessels, this is Captain Torres of the TRS Prometheus Unbound. We are moving to engage the Void constructs. Clear the combat zone and maintain minimum safe distance of 50,000 kilometers. Do not attempt to assist. Your weapons will only interfere with our targeting solutions." Zarthek's tactical officer quickly traced the transmission's origin. "Admiral, that signal is coming from the Terran system, Earth. But that's impossible. Human technology is decades behind ours. Their ships couldn't possibly threaten the Void Seekers." The unknown vessel charged directly into the heart of the Void formation, moving with a precision and speed that defied everything Zarthek knew about space combat. As it approached the nearest enemy ship, its massive cannon began building energy that made the space around it ripple like water. When it fired, something unprecedented happened. The beam wasn't like any weapon Zarthek had ever seen. Instead of energy or projectiles, it seemed to fire-controlled chaos, a stream of quantum foam that struck the Void Seeker and made its impossible geometry flicker and destabilize. For the first time in recorded history, one of the ancient machines actually staggered. "Impossible," his science officer whispered. "The enemy ship is taking damage. Real, actual damage." The human vessel didn't stop with one shot. It began an intricate dance through the void formation, using some kind of reality anchor system to maintain coherence in space that was becoming increasingly unstable. Its weapons fired again and again, each shot precisely targeted at points where the enemy ship seemed most vulnerable to quantum disruption. "Admiral," his tactical officer reported, "the human ship is using weapons specifically designed to fight enemies that exist partially outside normal physics. Their reality anchors are more advanced than anything in our databases. And that cannon, it's generating controlled quantum foam cascades that can destabilize matter that exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously." Zartek realized he was witnessing something that would rewrite military doctrine across the galaxy. The humans hadn't disappeared from galactic politics. They had gone away to solve problems that everyone else thought were impossible. The Prometheus Unbound was vastly outnumbered, facing 12 void seekers with weapons that could unmake planets. But it was fighting with a confidence and tactical knowledge that suggested its crew had been preparing for exactly this battle. Their movements were precise, their targeting perfect, and their weapons actually worked against an enemy that had never been hurt before. "Sir, more human ships are emerging from hyperspace," his sensor operator announced. 3 more vessels appeared, each with the same angular, predatory design as the first. The reality anchor cruiser Einstein's Revenge began generating stability, fields that allowed Confederation ships to operate in areas where spacetime had been damaged. The quantum foam destroyer Hawking's Fire unleashed swarms of missiles that seemed to exist in several dimensions at once. But the most impressive was the massive carrier that emerged last. The New Geneva was easily 3 times the size of Zarthek's flagship, and it immediately began deploying squadrons of fighters equipped with weapons that made reality bend around them. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Remnant Fleet," came a transmission on standard Confederation frequencies. "Admiral Zarthek, recommend you withdraw your forces to minimum safe distance. We're about to deploy experimental weapons that could destabilize local spacetime." "Terran Remnant Fleet?" Zarthek's first officer asked. "Sir, we have no records of humans having anything like this kind of military capability." Zarthek watched as the human vessels engaged the Void Seekers with tactics that seemed impossible. They fought aggressively, using the enemy's reality warping abilities against them. When Void Seekers tried to phase out of normal space, human, quantum foam weapons forced them back into reality where they could be targeted. When the ancient machines tried to use their void weapons, human reality anchors contained the damage and prevented it from spreading. "How long?" he asked his tactical officer. "Sir? How long have they been preparing for this? Those ships, those weapons, that level of tactical coordination, you don't develop that overnight." His tactical officer ran quick calculations based on the technology they were observing. "Based on the advancement over baseline human capabilities we saw 30 years ago, I'd estimate 3 decades of focused development, sir. They've been building a fleet specifically designed to fight reality-warping enemies for most of our careers." The battle raged for 3 hours. Zarthek watched as the human fleet systematically destroyed every Void Seeker in the formation, using weapons and tactics that seemed to come from a completely different understanding of physics. When the last enemy ship fell to coordinated fire from reality disruption weapons, he realized that everything he thought he knew about galactic military balance was wrong. Admiral Chen's face appeared on his main screen. She was older than he had expected, with gray hair and the kind of scars that came from fighting wars that most people never heard about. "Admiral Zarthek," she said formally, "I regret that we weren't able to arrive sooner. Too many good people died here today." "Admiral Chen," Zarthek replied, still trying to process what he had witnessed. Thank you, but I have to ask, where did you get weapons that can hurt the Void Seekers? Our best scientists said it was impossible." Chen's expression was grim. 30 years ago, Earth tried to warn the Confederation about threats stirring in dark space. We were told our concerns were primitive paranoia. We were blocked from expanding into the Outer Rim and limited in our access to advanced technology. So we left. And used your isolation to develop weapons the rest of us thought were impossible, Zarthek finished. We didn't have a choice, Chen said simply. When no one else will prepare for the nightmare, someone has to become the thing that fights monsters. As the human fleet regrouped and began rescue operations for Confederation survivors, Zarthek realized that the galaxy's understanding of humanity had been completely wrong. They hadn't been primitive or weak. They had been focused on preparing for threats that civilized races refused to acknowledge. Now those threats were here, and humanity had emerged from 30 years of exile, ready for a war that everyone else was losing. The chase began at the Helix Nebula and stretched across 3 star systems as Captain Marcus Torres led the surviving Void Seekers away from the civilian evacuation routes. The Prometheus Unbound couldn't win a straight fight against 12 remaining enemy ships, but winning wasn't the point. His mission was to buy time and gather intelligence for the larger human fleet that was already moving to intercept. Captain, enemy formation is maintaining pursuit, his tactical officer reported. They're staying just outside optimal range of our quantum foam projectors. Marcus studied the tactical display, noting how the Void Seekers moved. They weren't just following. They were learning. Each time his ship used its reality anchors or fired its exotic weapons, the enemy adapted their approach slightly. These ancient machines had destroyed countless civilizations, and they learned from every encounter. They're testing us, he realized, seeing what our capabilities are before committing to a full engagement. The running battle continued for 6 hours, with the Prometheus Unbound using hit-and-run tactics to keep the enemy engaged while avoiding decisive combat. Marcus's crew worked with precision, born from years of training for exactly this scenario. But he could see the strain beginning to show. Fighting enemies that could edit reality required constant vigilance and perfect coordination. Then the cavalry arrived. Admiral Chen's voice came over the comm. Captain Torres, this is the New Geneva. We have 12 more ships inbound, and we're ready to field test some new toys. The Terran remnant fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, each ship taking position with the kind of precision that came from decades of shared training. The reality anchor cruiser Einstein's Revenge immediately began generating stability fields that made spacetime solid enough for normal physics to function properly. The quantum foam destroyer Hawking's Fire launched probability disruption missiles that forced the Void Seekers back into normal space where they could be targeted. But it was the arrival of Admiral Chen's flagship that changed everything. The massive carrier New Geneva deployed squadrons of fighters equipped with weapons that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. More importantly, it carried humanity's ultimate weapon, the device they had spent 30 years developing and had never dared to test. All ships maintain minimum safe distance, Chen ordered. We're deploying the causal severance device. Marcus felt his blood chill. He had read the theoretical papers on causal severance, but he had never imagined they would actually build one. The weapon was designed to cut sections of spacetime loose from the universal timeline, creating isolated pockets of reality that could be manipulated or destroyed without affecting the surrounding universe. Are you sure about this, Admiral? He asked over a private channel. The simulations showed a 30% chance of creating a permanent rift in spacetime. Captain, Chen replied grimly, we're fighting an enemy that eats galaxies. A little spacetime damage is acceptable collateral. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded military history. The human fleet didn't fight like the Confederation Navy, with its emphasis on massive ships and overwhelming firepower. Instead, they used tactics based on 30 years of studying how to fight enemies that existed partially outside normal reality. They were aggressive but precise, using the Void Seekers' own reality warping abilities against them. When enemy ships tried to phase out of normal space, human quantum foam weapons forced them back into reality. When the ancient machines attempted to use their void weapons, human reality anchors contained the damage and prevented it from spreading to nearby space. The tide turned when Chen authorized deployment of the causal severance device. The weapon didn't look impressive, just a small missile launched from the New Geneva's forward tube. But when it detonated in the center of the void formation, reality itself seemed to hiccup. A sphere of absolute stillness expanded from the detonation point, cutting 3 enemy ships loose from the normal flow of time. Within that sphere, the Void Seekers found themselves trapped in a pocket of reality that no longer followed the same rules as the rest of the universe. Their reality warping, weapons turned against them, creating feedback loops that tore their impossible geometries apart from within. "My God," Marcus whispered, watching ancient machines that had survived for millions of years simply unravel as their own weapons destroyed them in a universe that operated by different rules. The remaining Void Seekers tried to retreat, but the human fleet was ready for that too. Quantum foam mines had been seeded throughout the system, creating reality anchors that prevented the enemy from phasing into the dimensions they used for faster-than-light travel. Trapped in normal space, the ancient machines found themselves vulnerable to weapons they had never encountered before. The last Void Seeker fell to coordinated fire from reality disruption cannons, its twisted hull finally succumbing to weapons, specifically designed to hurt things that shouldn't exist. As it died, the machine released a pulse of information, a quantum broadcast that human sensors barely managed to intercept. "Admiral," the New Geneva's science officer reported, "we're detecting a massive data transmission from the destroyed enemy ship. It appears to be some kind of status report or final communication." Chen studied the data as her computers worked to decode it. What they found made her realize that their victory, impressive as it was only the beginning of a much larger war. "The Void Seekers were just scouts," she announced to the fleet. "According to this transmission, something much larger is stirring in the space between galaxies, something that makes these reality-eating ships look like small patrol boats." Marcus felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. "How long do we have?" "Based on the travel time indicated in their communication, maybe 2 years before the main force arrives. But Admiral, there's something else. The transmission indicates that the Seekers have been systematically testing the galaxy's defenses for the past century. This wasn't their first incursion, just the first one large enough for anyone to notice. The implications were staggering. For 100 years, ancient machines had been probing the galaxy's military capabilities, learning about every weapon system and tactical doctrine. They knew exactly how strong the Confederation was, how their ships fought, what their weapons could do. But they hadn't known about humanity. 30 years of isolation in the Outer Rim had kept human military development completely hidden from their reconnaissance. The Void Seekers had planned for every possible threat, except the one that had actually destroyed them. "Open a channel to Admiral Zarthek," Chen ordered. The Confederation commander's face appeared on the main screen, his expression showing a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. "Admiral Chen, on behalf of the Confederation, I want to thank you for your intervention. Without your fleet, we would have lost everything." "Admiral Zarthek," Chen replied formally, "Earth is prepared to offer our assistance in the larger war that's coming, but I want to make our position clear from the start. Humanity will no longer be treated as a junior partner or primitive cousin. We've spent 30 years becoming something new." She gestured to the tactical display, where the debris of 12 impossible enemy ships drifted in space that had been stabilized by human technology. "We're the civilization that prepared for the galaxy's worst nightmares, while everyone else dismissed them as mythology. We're the species that learned to fight enemies that eat reality itself, and we're the only ones who have actually won a battle against the forces that are coming to destroy us all." Zarthek nodded slowly. "What do you propose?" "A joint fleet," Chen said. "Human ships and Confederation vessels working together with weapons that can actually hurt these things. We'll share our technology and tactical knowledge, but Earth commands any operation involving reality-warping enemies." As the first joint human Confederation fleet began forming in the aftermath of the battle, Marcus Torres looked out at the stars and wondered what his species had become during their years of exile. They had left galactic civilization as outcasts and primitives, dismissed by races that considered themselves more advanced. Now they were returning as guardians, armed with weapons that could wound unreality itself and carrying knowledge that might save everyone. When no help was expected, when conventional forces had failed completely, humanity had emerged from the infinite black not as refugees seeking aid, but as the defenders they had always chosen to become. The ancient enemy had returned to consume another galaxy, confident in their knowledge of every threat they might face. But this time, they had encountered a species that had spent 30 years preparing specifically for their arrival, a species that remembered what the rest of the galaxy had forgotten. Sometimes the greatest threats require the most desperate solutions. The real war was just beginning, but for the first time in millions of years, the Void Seekers had faced an enemy that could actually fight back. And that changed everything.